So picking up today, we're actually going to move away from the 3D shapes that we've been working on in the previous examples, and we're actually going to move on to trying to start understanding the non-pipeline based workflow within Touchdesigner that is still a pipeline, but actually more of a sandwich. Let me bring up Paint. So at the moment, we have been working in a container called Project1. Proj1. And inside that container, we have made a bunch of nodes that connect to each other. Yes, I know, I missed my calling as an artist. So we made a bunch of containers that connect to each other, and the last one specifically has been called out1. And in that case, it has shown as the main item inside Touchdesigner. Let me start a blank, a new default panel rather than this empty one. So we have a bunch of tops, a geo going to a node called out1, and that out1 is then set as the background for this container called project1. But what does all of that actually mean, and how can we use something like a container and an output to control the flow and access more options within Touchdesigner that we may not know about yet? Well, that's a great question. So let's have a look. Back in here, we've been working inside Project1. But what we need to understand is Touchdesigner isn't limited to working like this, a bunch of nodes inside a container. We can have 100 containers, all with different code, all subset inside each other as if they were layers in a Photoshop screen. Layers that we can turn on, move around, or control as we want. For example, I could have one container that was 1920 by 1080, and then I could make another container that is 400 by 300, and make that inside. So let's say this is container 1. I can make container 2 inside container 1's network so that it floats within its space. And then container 2 becomes bound to the scope of container 1. So if it's outside, we won't see it. So over here, it means that it would be invisible. And we can then animate and control and move it. Similar to geometry or the button or slider I think we dealt with in our first stream. Instead of having an image or a picture, as with, with our previous example, we can introduce the idea of having interactive elements on our screen. For example, we can have a button, or we can have a slider, all of which would exist as containers inside the container 1 network, but allow us to interact with it in the panel as if it were a completely unique object. So if this masterpiece doesn't make any sense, let's actually visualize that. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a container, call this master, and it's on the top layer of my network. And I know that I'm going to use this to open on my laptop, so I'm going to make this 1920 by 1080 in width and height. Simple as that. I'm going to switch my panel viewer to be my master, and you'll see that it does some formatting to fit it into this space. But I hear you ask, Michael, how do I know that's working? On my container, I'm going to go over to the look panel, give it a background color, and turn the alpha up. And you can see that the entire screen over here turns red because it is showing exactly what this panel is showing. Let's turn that back down. Let's leave that for now, actually. And then we want to go inside of our master. So now, network-wise, we are operating inside the networks, the master space, and we can still view our master panel over here. So the first thing I was talking about is I did a movie file in, connected it to a null, and let's say I want this null to be my output. So that's the final thing in my chain. That's the last thing it's showing. Let's change our banana to a countdown. So now I have a bunch of pipeline working here that leads to a single top output. I want this to be my background. So there's nowhere obvious to do it in here, and that's because it's actually a setting of our container. In the look page, you'll see we have something called background top. What I need to do is reference output in this node here. When you're not working in the same level of a network as the node you want to reference, there's two ways we can access it. The first thing is I could type its full path, so I could do operator, well, I wouldn't need operator in this case. I would do /master/output, and you can see that it will take up the form. But what happens if I actually wanted to reference a picture that was 7 nodes deep? I would have master, container, present, output. It starts getting really long and convoluted. So what Touchdesigner has to allow it to operate is quick referencing, as with Python. So if I was to include 2 dots before this, I would be telling Touchdesigner in this container specifically to go up 1 level in my network and look for the node output. But I don't want to go up 1 level, I want to go inside myself and get it. So I'm going to use a single dot. So single dot, the name of the network node I want to look for, it's going to go inside that container and find one called output. And now you can see no matter my transparency or alpha on my background, I can't see it because this is a 16:9 video, and it's stretching to fill. If I did native resolution, it would be tiny because it's only 600 pixels long. And you can still see our red background around it. Okay, so inside here, let's explore that a little bit more. I'm going to leave my timeline or my timer running constantly in the background, so you know that if we see the timer, that is showing the native background of the container. But the first example I gave you in Paint was that I could introduce other panels in here to do other things. So I'm going to introduce another container. I'm going to go to my look panel again, and I'm going to give it another color. Turn it up. And suddenly you see we have this 400 by 300 square that appears in the bottom left hand corner at 0, 0. Now, similar to this, I could go inside. I could have another network, so I could have a moving file in this time. I can make another null and call this one output. Because we're in different networks, we can have nodes of the same names across different levels. And I could set this look to output as well. Let's do native or fit width so it scales properly. Turn that down. So suddenly I have another container that allows it to accept transparency, displaying an image that isn't necessarily inside my processing for this level. I also don't need to just use containers to reference networks inside themselves. While a container holds a network, it doesn't need to be the sole place of one. So this smaller 400 by 300 container, I can also reference the same output as my master. And suddenly, I now have a clock within my clock at the different scale that I can position wherever I want within the space. And instead of fill width, we can just do stretch. And let's do 320 by 240, so 16 by 9. And I continue asking, Michael, why on earth would I use this? What is the purpose of this? And the honest answer is you will know the situations where you need to use it when they do come up. But the idea of containers within containers within containers is a great way to share and manage code. If I load up the example that I previously showed you, so if I go to Program for People, Touchdesigner 101, and load the Hack Queue encoder again, this is built entirely on subset containers within other containers that are programmatically turned on and off. I think I might have actually showed this in another example before. But this splash screen is a container that has containers in it. Every menu thereafter is a container with a bunch of containers for the left or right, and inside them or a bunch more containers, and inside them are a bunch more containers. So you can start to see the layering and sort of the complexity of a program you can make here. Whereas in a more conventional text-based programming language, we would use object functions to control our flow. In here, we can use the idea of containers to contain our code. We also don't necessarily need to have a visual output for a container. If we wanted to go really down the function or object, we can use the base to contain, exact same as a container. It can take inputs in, out, manage them, but it has no displaying or movement parameters. It's literally just a container to store pipeline work. But because take container was already used, it has a different name. So for example, I could have a top in going to a top out. In level out. So here you go. Now that I've added an in and out, we'll see an in and an out. I can plug my image into that, and this base serves the single function of inverting the colors of anything that comes into it. Again, you'll find times like these when it crops up that you just can't manage to have your entire network on a single level, or something along to the same description. But the power of a container comes into its own when we introduce the idea of interactivity. So instead, I'm going to delete this container. So now I've got my single background. I'm going to come up to my master level, and I'm going to right click it. Actually, I'll do that later. So right now, I've got my master panel showing on the right hand side. I'm going to go to comp, and instead of adding a container, I'm going to add a button. And the exact same way as when we turned on the transparency of our container, we can see that something appears. In this case, it's the button that is drawn in this window. So I'm going to make it a bit bigger and a bit wider and move its position within the space. And just like the example I gave you, the button itself is a container for more code. So in here, I'm going to make the font size of my button a bit bigger so I can see it. And now I have a button on my screen that I can click. But this also becomes an interactive element on the master layer container. I could have another container called buttons. And in here, I could add another collection of buttons. So on this master layer, I have a container that, if we turn up transparency, is this size. That has two buttons inside of it that I can move around. From my master layer, I can still interact with these buttons because they're non-covered, they're non-intrusive, and they are within my master's layer. Even though they're multiply subset, I can still hover over and interact with these buttons in a subset container to master while on master. This is getting a bit too inception-y to make sense, but hopefully that has some clarity when you start playing about with it. One thing to note would be, though, that if we observe this black edge, this is the size of this container at 400 by 300. If I was to move it up here so it's over this button, I can no longer interact with that one because it's obviously covered. But if we didn't have the color on, the button behind here is no longer clickable. And that's because of the way the layering works inside Touchdesigner. It's basically a first come, first serve basis, or first in, first out. So this was the first button I placed, and then I placed this other container on top of it. So although these are both containers in their own right in this space, this one now lies under this one because this was added second. There is options to sort of align and control how things are organized inside a panel. Yeah, I'm just trying to find it. it doesn't matter for now. All you need to know is that just be careful where you place your other containers within the space, because if they cover each other, they won't load. So in this case, I would just make my container small that have my buttons in it. Make it big enough so it can still hold everything, but small enough so it doesn't delete them entirely. So the general idea would be the size of your buttons with a little buffer. So now I can interact with both of these, move them around, but button up here is fully interactable. Okay, so I think that sort of covers it for UIs and interactivity. We'll come back to buttons and actual user interfaces in another episode, but for now we want to move on to the idea of, or probably a more complex theory that's good to start covering early, and that is time within the scope of containers. Until now, we have worked mostly with a non-timeline driven environment, as in we've let things run at their own pace and not tried to interfere with that. But when it comes to video playback and show controllers, for like projection or projection mapping, one of the main outputs for Touchdesigner, it gets really tricky to manage these videos and flows without proper time management. So when you create a Touchdesigner file, it has this local environment, and in here there is a MIDI, maps, and time, a bunch of stuff that helps Touchdesigner work. It also contains a bunch of information about what your Touchdesigner commands actually do, your shortcuts. If you were to delete this, it would actually break a load of stuff inside Touchdesigner. So you probably don't want to do this and delete your main local on the master level. But what I can do is I can right click any component I've made, comp, and I can do add component time. And while it was little, you would have seen a little flash there that reset the movie file in here. And that's because now this movie file was swapped from being driven by the master timeline to this local timeline here. So inside this one, there's a time file. If I stop it, you can see the video stops. If I play it, you can see it plays. But we have a way more options than that. So all you need to imagine is that we can make a component, add a timeline to it, and that component's network will be entirely driven by that local timeline. Mostly because all of them reference in some form me.time.frames, and me being the component and local being its own time. But what can we actually do with this, I hear you asking? Well, first thing we're going to do is I'm going to stop this video from being sequential, and I'm going to change it to lock to timeline. And that's going to swap it from allowing the video to play at its own rules and obey strictly the timeline for this level. So I can visualize this timeline. I'm going to press S, which means it sets it to the main scope timeline down the bottom. And I'm also going to push I, and that means it allows it to run independently. Independently in this case meaning that we can run multiple timelines without them interfering with each other. For example, I can go up to the master layer, pause it, and my main local timeline inside master will keep running even though local.time is paused. Played, paused, reversed. This is not affected. That's a really important concept that I want you to try and play about with. So in here, I now know that I have a timeline. My rule of thumb would be that if you're ever interfering with a timeline, never interfere with the timeline from its own network. So a case for that would be if I had a button here that was a null, change this to momentary. And if I was to do chop execute, so chop execute, if you remember from the first exercises, it allows us to run bits of Python code based on a chop action. In this case, I'm doing off to on. What I'm going to do is off to on, I am going to set me.time.play. So to reference my own network's timeline, I'm going to reference myself. I'm going to reference time, which is the time in here, and I'm going to say play equal 1. So in the timeline, there's the play parameter, and we want that to be equal to 1. I'm going to change my button to toggle down, and I'm going to enable off to on. And in here, I'm going to say me.time.play equals 0. Don't worry if you're not that comfortable with Python yet, because we will be coming back to that later. So now you can see I have a button. If I push it, it plays the timeline. If I click it again, so it's not active, it stops it. Play, pause, play, pause, play, pause. The reason I'm telling you not to interfere with a timeline from its own network is because you run into what we call cooking problems. Cooking being the process of what actually tells a Touchdesigner pipeline to run. So, for example, in the first episode, we talked about output asking for null, null asking for the invert, base, invert asking for the movie file in, and so on. And the movie file in would then ask the time for its current frame, etc. If we don't have the ability to perform a cook, as in if the timeline is paused, there is a chance that we could never restart this environment. It seems like I'm remembering this from earlier versions of Touchdesigner, so they obviously seem to have addressed it to some scope where a button forces this chop to cook, and for example you can see the value change, which means it is cooking even though the timeline isn't running, which means that is then passing the parameter into local. But for now I would always set something like this up on this layer. And now obviously me.time.play wouldn't work, so I would do operator, I would do master / local / time. Oh no, that should work. / local. Let's have a look. .play. I'll change that to be 0. No, that does not work. Oh. Oh, it's all gone wrong. There we go, sorry. So I can no longer reference the network's timeline by doing me.time.play, which says, look at myself, reference my time controller and tell it to stop. I now need to physically reference the master local time operator and its play parameter. But that's clunky because in our master we have no control over this button, or outside of our master we have no control of this button. So what I would do is I would do something like container second level. Inside here, let's just duplicate this entire network. I'm going to disable my invert. Let's just delete that altogether. So now I have a subset timeline. Let's change its loop to be ./output. So I have a second panel that is on the timeline. Now what I want to do is add a component to this. So you saw a flash, but on my master level I'm going to add a slider, and this slider is going to control my time of my second level. So again, I'm going to introduce a chop execute. And that chop execute is going to change on value change. I'm going to delete all this. And we're going to say operator second underscore level. So we want to go and look at this operator. Inside, we want to look at its local. And from there, we want to look at its time node. And the parameter we want is play, and I'm going to set that equal to val. Val being the value of the input from the slider. So if we make this a bit more attractive by moving it up, setting it bigger. So now in theory, the value of my slider should control the playback. Because of the way that play works, it can't have a variable for the play is either on, off, or negative to reverse it. You can't have a variable, so at the moment it's not playing at 0.6 the normal speed. We'll need to look at something else for that. But I will show you how we can change that in a minute. Okay, yeah, so on my local, I want to change this to be maths, and maths, I want to change its range from to -1. So now when it's on the left hand side, it should, as it obviously doesn't work. So here is a prime example of what I was trying to demonstrate before. So right now, value change should be passing -1 to the play parameter, because that's what it's set to, and that's what the code is set to do. So if I was to print we can see the value is now -1, but it has not properly passed a parameter into here. Well, we'll come back and look at how to address this in the future, but the correct way is we basically need to hard assign -1 to the value play rather than trying to pass part of the negative value here. Okay, earlier we made both of our movie file ins. I say both because now this and second level are being driven by locked to timeline features. It just so happens that this, if I introduce something called the info chop and we zoom in, we can see that this has a length of 100 and a sample rate of 60, which basically means every 60 seconds has a length of 100. Our timeline just so happens to be, it's already a sample rate of 60, but it has a length of 600, which means that this video perfectly fits into our timeline 6 times. I just did the length of my timeline divided by the length of this, length being calculated by the sample rate of the patch. Since it's being controlled by timeline, and I have this local timeline set as my master, I'm going to start fiddling about with things. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make its end 50. And it has apparently no effect. Oh, I've not selected the right timeline, that's why. It was on the... So now I've set the timeline of my master level to be 50 frames long at a sample rate of 60. So now this video that is locked to timeline will go between 1 and 50 every single time. If I slow down the sample rate, oh no, that did not have the effect we want. Never mind. Let's turn it back to 60. So now it's cooking 60. It's still cooking 60 frames every second, but my timeline is only just under a second long. As you saw there, I can increase or change the frames per second. So if I went to 120, this is now only going to show 25 frames in the same 50 frames we're cooking, because it is locked to timeline. And it's going to cook the entire process twice as fast. If I changed it to half, so 30, it's going to show the full 100, because we're going to half of its sample rate, which means we're doubling, or we're going to half its sample rate, which means we're halving the length of time it takes to play. We're basically skipping every second frame in this movie, so that it's drawing the entire 100 frames in it within the 50 frame boundary that we've got. Whereas if I change this back to 60, change this to, let's say, 100. So I'm making the end of my timeline 100. I'm going to change the start time of my timeline to 50. And again, because my video is locked to timeline, it's going to go from 50 to 100 every time. All the while, oh, I don't think I've set this to be the correct timeline yet. So you can see that my second level is also doing the same snapping, and that's because it's not running on its own independence. Click Run Independently. Change my timeline, it should be default, so it's doing 1 to 600. So now, second level is perfectly looping still, running on its own unique timeline, whereas my master level timeline is doing some random stuff. So it's just important to sort of be aware of which timeline you're running in, so that you don't make the mistakes that I just made on video. And this can be a super powerful tool. You can use it to sample very specific parts out of videos. You can use it to cut and sort of shorten and manage videos, fell in its face. But the idea that you can have multiple independent timelines based on what you're doing is a super powerful tool to know. And this example of having two videos running within each other at different time rates is a really nice effect and a really nice thing to just try and understand, especially at this stage in early learning. So we will come back to containers and containers more and more, and it's something that I will just use without explaining why I'm doing it or what effect it's going to have, in the hope that you understand that buttons and videos both sit, buttons, containers, sliders, all sit within a sort of a pancake layer or sandwich layer style of build-up.